Comparing the Buddha and the Gospel of John to aliens touching a truck out on a desert road might not be the normal starting point for a podcast, I admit, but I'm really intrigued by what they've been saying about that truck. I'm Kevin Caldwell. Welcome to Sacred Wisdom, Sacred Texts, an exploration of some of humanity's most influential sacred writings. They've become my soul friends, daily companions, spiritual guides, and springs of wisdom. As you know, if you've been listening along, in the last episode I told a story about 4 aliens who couldn't see. They landed on a desert road and stumbled on an abandoned truck. They each felt around different portions of the truck and tried to describe it to each other. And I compared that to John, the author of the Gospel of John, and the Buddha, who each came to their respective understandings of life and reality by direct experience of various sorts. In other words, by touching the truck and then describing it to us. As I imagine myself talking with John and the Buddha, I compare it to inviting friends over to my house so that I can introduce them to each other. And as conversation starters in this case, I decided to focus on 3 questions. What is real? What's wrong? And how do we fix it? So it's not exactly a casual chat over coffee. In the last episode, we got as far as the what is real question. And in case you missed that, here's a little summary. For the Buddha, especially according to the Mahayana Buddhist tradition, the end or purpose of the Buddha's Dhamma teaching is to cultivate an all-encompassing compassion for all things and all beings. That kind of compassion is the nature of what is sometimes called the Buddha mind. And as a result, what I'm referring to as ultimate reality, which I know is not Buddhist vocabulary, is that all-encompassing compassion. And for John, ultimate reality is the divine nature. My explorations of John's writing caused me to summarize his way of seeing the divine nature as towardsness and into-ness, embrace, openness, and humility. And in a letter that bears the name of John, the author distilled the divine nature into one short phrase: God is love. And in the same letter, John makes it clear that the clearest indicator that a person has come to know God, who is love, will, in other words, have come to know ultimate reality. The clearest sign of that is that they're actually sharing in that same divine nature. They love. The one who loves is born of God because God is love, he says in that letter. So here's one way to summarize that first conversation about what is real. Reality can be described as all-encompassing compassion, the Buddha mind, and the aim of life is to cultivate and share in that same reality, or to exude it even. Reality can be described as love, which is the nature of the divine, and the aim of love is to cultivate and share in that same reality. To exude it, we could say. Now, before moving on, there's 2 things I feel like I need to say at this juncture. First, and I know I'm repeating myself here, although neither John nor the Buddha speak about ultimate reality, it seems like the only concept available in English to convey what the truck is for them. Or at least, it's the only word I can think of. Second, boiling down the complexities and nuances of these 2 friends into such a brief summary of each of them can feel as if I'm just trying to smooth over the differences and kind of create a false sense of sameness. I'm not. There are real differences, and I'm going to try to bring at least some of the differences as I see them into the picture later in this episode. But what I want to make as clear as I can is that what the Buddha and John experienced was the same truck. It's not as if John landed and stumbled across, say, a motorcycle, while the Buddha found the truck. So, next, the two questions I didn't get to last time. What's wrong? How do we fix it? And let's just affirm that something's wrong. Because here's the thing. Throughout human history, and indeed in our day-to-day lives, in what we hear about in the news, experience in our relationships, what we know to be true of our inner worlds in moments when we're honest with ourselves, in all of those dimensions of life, the evidence that we have suggests that whatever reality might be, it is anything but the all-encompassing compassion and divine love that my two friends are talking about. Something seems wrong. Both of my friends have ways of describing what is wrong, and they have ways of talking about how to fix it. In fact, the Buddha's teaching actually begins from the fact that something's wrong. There's suffering, and its primary cause is craving. The Buddha teaches the Eightfold Path as the remedy to that, but he begins with what's wrong. John's writing begins with the divine nature, but he's also aware that something's wrong, and he gets to it fairly quickly. His primary way of describing what is wrong centers around what he calls darkness. And as a result, the remedy is to come to the light, which he also believes exists. Suffering and the elimination of craving, darkness and light. These are very different cognitive worlds for talking about what's wrong and how to fix it. So let's dig deeper and see if they're actually both at the same truck or not. In the last episode, I let the Buddha go first, so it only seems fair this time that we start with John. So, John and darkness and light. I'll start with his first mention of what's wrong, the darkness, which comes in John chapter 1, verse 5. The light still shines in the darkness, and the darkness did not snuff out the light. Notice that in some ways, the problem and the solution are already here together. They're like flip sides of each other, because it makes sense that if the problem is darkness, then the solution is light, right? However, that doesn't tell us what darkness is. To understand that, or at least how John sees that, we need more context, which, as it happens, will also reveal more about the nature of the light as well. And to give us that context, I want to put verse 5 where it belongs, which is as a concluding phrase in a whole section that started back with, surprise, surprise, verse 1 of that chapter. So here's those verses in my translation. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was towards God, and God was the Word. In other words, God is this Word that was towards God in the beginning, the Word through whom all things came to be, and without whom nothing came to be. So that's the context that comes before verse 5, which I read a little earlier and will come back to pretty soon. The light shines in the darkness, and the darkness did not snuff out the light. I spent a number of episodes explaining my understanding of that whole section, but again, here's a summary. These verses are the primary reason that I say that for John, the divine life, the divine nature, is towardsness. There's a word, John says, that is towards God, but God is also that word that is towards God. To be towards is part of the essence of the divine nature. The divine is also the source of all things. Everything came to be through the divine agency, we could say. And that vocabulary speaks to me of not just some sort of indirect creation, like a manufacturer of a machine, but of an intimate process, almost as if everything that exists has somehow passed through, and that's the word that's used, passed through the mesh of the divine being and is flavored and scented with it as a result. But John singles out one particular thing that came to be among the all things came to be, and here it is. What came to be in him, in other words, in that word that is towards God, who is the word towards God, what came to be in him was life. And that life was the light of all humankind. There's light again. Or in a more expanded rendering of that same passage that I might make, What came to be in him, in that word, in the towardsness that is the divine nature, was life, and this life was the light of all humankind. But that's awkward at best. Accurate, I think, but awkward. The emphasis here is on the fact that what came to be through the divine towardsness was not just living beings, but life itself. Not just things that are alive, but we could say aliveness itself came to be. And next, here's verse 5 again, which is the first hint in this, what's called the prologue of John, the first hint that something's wrong. That light still shines in the darkness, and the darkness did not snuff out the light. Prior to this verse, there's nothing to suggest anything amiss. And when it finally does show up, it's almost mentioned in passing. The light came to be as life, which is in the divine nature of this God who is towards. All this stuff came to be, and light was a result. Oh, and by the way, the darkness hasn't snuffed it out. The light is still shining in the darkness. So what did he mean by darkness? There's other places where John says more about this darkness and what it's like. First, I'm going to take us to a later portion in this same text, the Gospel of John, chapter 3. And I'm going to pick up things at verse 19. And here again is my rendering of the Greek text. The light has come into the world, but people love the darkness instead of the light because what they do is wrong. Everyone who does what is wrong hates the light and doesn't come towards the light. Otherwise, what they do will be laid bare. But whoever lives in keeping with what is true comes towards the light. And as a result, it becomes clear that what they do is done in union with God. Now, the darkness in these verses is, we could say, the refusal to see oneself honestly. It's rooted in a fear of being seen. To avoid the light and remain in darkness means that we cultivate the habit of ignoring all the subtle and not so subtle hints that something's wrong inside of us. Something's wrong in what we do and in how we feel and how we think and what we say. Memories, recalling things we said or did that make us cringe or feel guilty. It's refusing to pay attention to that vague sense of uneasiness we often carry, scared to turn around and ask ourselves, all right, what is it? What's wrong here? Why am I feeling or remembering or thinking these things? When we live like that, we actually slowly grow calluses over our consciences, and gradually we feel less and less. We're in the darkness, John says. Now, how do we fix that? If that's what's wrong, how do we deal with it? I'll go back to John 1 and his prologue. A few verses after John says the light shines in the darkness and the darkness has not snuffed it out, the text goes on to say more about the light. Let me pick up from John chapter 1, verse 9. There was the true light, the light that enlightens every person. And that light was coming into the world. The light was in the world and through the world. And though the world was made through him, the world didn't recognize that light. The light came to what belonged to him, but they didn't receive him. And yet, to as many as those who did receive this light, those who believed in his name and nature, he gave the right to become children of God. So, a few things to notice here. Light is everywhere. It's available to all people. It's the light of all humankind, and it has been since the very beginning, according to John. The problem begins when people either refuse to come to the light, as we saw in John 3, or, as he puts it here in chapter 1, when they refuse to receive the light that comes to them. And notice it's both. We can come to the light, but the light actually makes the first move. Light is streaming all around us, trying to bring light to us. The relationship of the universal nature of this light that I've just mentioned, and its availability at all times for all people, and the relationship of all that with the particularity of the light in the first century of the common era, human man Jesus, is a topic I went into in several episodes prior, and I can't represent it here except just to say it's both and. In other words, John does speak of a very particular, specific reality of the light coming into the world at a specific time, in a specific place, in a specific human, Jesus. But the light that does so is the same light that was, is, and always will be available to everybody, and still was when Jesus was walking around on the earth. It didn't stop being universal. For John, the universal light didn't cease being universal when it came into the world in a particular person. He would also say, I'm pretty sure, that the light doesn't cease to have this particular quality in Jesus just because it is also universal. It's both and. All right, putting what I've been talking about together, what's the solution, the fix to what went wrong according to John? And we've already seen it, but let me just try to make it really explicit here. There is a proactive side. Seek out the light. That means our proactivity. Seek it out. Come out of the shadows. Come out of hiding. And there's a reactive side. Be open to having things shown to us about ourselves. Welcome the truth without fear. Receive it and believe it when it comes. So there's a active and a receptive, a proactive and reactive dimension to the fix for what it means to come into the light and have the light come into us. So in summary, we could say it's being willing to be seen, being willing to be honest, being willing to be self-aware. But that leads to something else in John, another dimension of the fix for what is wrong. In John 3, what happens when we step into the light, we're told, is that we also discover that the good things we do, the honest things we do and think and feel, are actually not really done, said, or felt by us, not on our own. They are done, in John's words, in union with God, in God. They are worked in God. And that happens in connection, in union, as I said. So when someone is honest and self-aware and living in truth, John says the divine is doing that in them. Or the flip side of the same coin, they're doing that in the divine. In the passage from John 1 that I cited, John puts that union a little differently. He says that when we receive the light and welcome it, no matter what it might reveal about us, good or bad, we receive life. We come alive, fully alive. For John, light flows from life. The divine life is the source of all things. Life is the light of humanity. And this means that it is light that leads us to life, which culminates in John being able to say in that section that when this happens, we become children of God, meaning we share the DNA. We come to share in the divine nature, which, as I summarized above, based on our last episode, is love. All right, now it's the Buddha's turn. What's wrong and how to fix it? As we've seen, the Buddha presented the Four Noble Truths in the same way that doctors in his time approached treating a patient. So for Dr. Buddha, the symptoms are that they're suffering. The diagnosis is that that suffering is caused by attachment and craving. The prognosis is that it is curable, it can cease, and the treatment is the Eightfold Path that leads to the cessation of that suffering. It's the cure for the disease, and it removes the root of craving and attachment. These four truths summarize the Buddha's answers to the two questions I'm focusing on: what's wrong and how it can be fixed. What's wrong? Truths 1 and 2, there's suffering due to craving. And how can it be fixed? Truths 3 and 4, suffering and craving can cease through the process of treatment described in the Eightfold Path, the 8 rights that we spent a long time exploring: right view, right resolve, right speech, right action, right livelihood, right effort, right mindfulness, and right concentration. In one sense, that seems simple enough, right? Here's a list. Let's just do them and tick off the boxes as we work our way through the treatment plan. Except, of course, for the fact that, as you know, if you have followed any of the other episodes regarding the Buddha, it's neither simple conceptually nor easy in practice. Without rehearsing all of that, here's just a few summary statements. What's wrong? Suffering and craving. Suffering includes, of course, physical pain, but also psychological and emotional pain, grief, loss, regret, fear, anger, bitterness, the suffering we experience as a byproduct of even the good and beautiful things we experience because they are going to cease. And we don't want that. We want them back once it happens, and we don't want them to stop to begin with. We hope and long for them, and they never materialize. Craving includes that sort of hope and longing for something, but it's also a hungry attachment to things we think we know, to ways of seeing life that are not actually real or true, but we think work for us, or we could make them work for us. In other words, it's an attachment to what the Buddha refers to as illusion, also referred to as delusion because of the ways we actively participate in illusion. We delude ourselves into thinking in certain ways, and then we act and live in accordance with our delusions. Delusions that are very similar to the sort of denial that we saw in John, it seems to me. Now, one of the main delusions we cultivate is that in spite of evidence to the contrary, we cling to the false idea or hope or whatever of permanence, of some state in which things we enjoy will always be there the same way, that we can get to a place where life hits cruise control and then never changes, or that we'll arrive where just everything is copacetic. It'll stay put. But of course, everything changes all the time. Things we enjoy are passing away, declining all the time, even as we enjoy them. And much of what we fear might happen is actually likely, or indeed certain, to happen. We will get sick. We will experience the disappointment of not achieving things we'd hoped. We will age and weaken. We will lose loved ones. We ourselves will die, and we will rot in the ground. And most of us will be forgotten within a generation once those closest to us also pass away, which they will. Yes, along the way, as things we wish wouldn't happen do happen. Good things we hoped for do happen also. But then they pass. Everything is constantly in that process of change. And the Buddha really urges us to just really let all of that sink in. Let the symptoms really sink in, and let the diagnosis of the cause really sink in. Now, some in his day and age consoled themselves with the idea that, okay, well, after death, I'm going to have another life. I'll still exist, maybe in another form. But one of the Buddha's primary insights is that the reality of what we think we know about that I that we think is going to continue after death is also an illusion. There is no I in the way we normally think of it, according to the Buddha. No such thing as an independent, permanent, self-contained, existing thing we call a self. So what is wrong is suffering and attachment characterized by two major realities. The suffering of the endless cycle of health and sickness, pleasure and pain, happiness and loss that's woven into the very fabric of everything, in which each moment is kind of a miniature version of the universal cycle of birth and rebirth. The suffering of rebirth is not just about being born and dying and then living again in some other form. The big cycle, the macro version of the impermanence of life and death and rebirth, is also taking place in micro version in every moment, with every breath that we take. In fact, right there, it just happened again. And second, there is suffering we experience due to the illusion of what I'll call the objectivity of existence. We delude ourselves with the idea that things and people and we ourselves exist in and of themselves exactly as we experience them, apart from our subjective experiences and interpretations. In fact, everything we think we know to be objectively real in exactly the way we experience and describe it is, according to the Buddha, really, well, these are my words, but I think it captures his thinking. It's really a noodle plate of our perceptions and interpretations. We're like the aliens touching the truck, and thinking that what we've touched and how we describe it is exactly what the truck really is. If all of that's what's wrong, then how do we fix it? And the fix is that eightfold path. That's the treatment. And though it has 8 elements, really, it can be summarized as a very carefully described, multifaceted, exacting process of facing reality, including the reality of ourselves, or not selves. For more detail, again, I'm going to refer you back to prior Buddha-focused episodes, but again, here's a high-level overview, just to keep it fresh. Right view and right resolve open the door by introducing us to the 4 truths about suffering and craving and the possibility of it ending, and by describing the kind of intention, resolve, that we will need to cultivate for the journey. The next 3 of the eightfold path, right speech, right action, and livelihood, take us into honest assessments of ourselves, not just what we say and do and how we live, but the motives behind our actions, the ripple effects of things we say and do and how we earn a living, and the intention behind it, and the emotional tone behind it, the impact of our lives on the lives of others, the subtle inner workings of our minds and emotions all start to come into play. And that process of self-awareness continues then with the other 3 of the eightfold path, right effort, mindfulness, and concentration, which progressively peel away layer after layer of the mental and cognitive and psychological levels of the inner workings of our minds. Inner workings which for the Buddha are tied to illusion about ourselves and our minds and our innermost processes. The Eightfold Path is Buddha's way of speaking about what we saw in John. The path is the process of coming out of darkness into light. The Buddha spells it out in far greater detail, spelling out the sorts of things the light will reveal and the way that it happens and the exact process for doing it. All right, let me try to summarize John and Buddha here. Let's step back and pull together the way each of my friends would answer the 3 questions that I posed. What's wrong? How to fix it? And what's real? What's wrong? John, darkness, denial, hiding from the light, refusal to face ourselves, fear of being seen and exposed. Sounds an awful lot like illusion and delusion. The Buddha, suffering that results from craving or attachment, which in turn is grounded in illusion and delusion, not seeking things as they are, including ourselves, which sounds an awful lot like darkness. For the Buddha, suffering and attachment and illusion result in a continuous cycle over and over, resulting in more suffering and attachment and so on. It's a karmic cycle because what we do and think has consequences. Primarily the consequence of remaining stuck in suffering and craving. John says that living in darkness and refusing to see and be seen also results in suffering, but he describes it differently. He calls it judgment. In John's day, most would have understood that to mean judgment day, a fixed point in time in the future, after which some will experience hell, literally, an idea I'll need to come back to when we get more friends in the room. And John does include that idea, although he reports Jesus saying that judgment has already come into the world with the light. Anyway, it's true that for John, there are consequences. Judgment has arrived, and it happens when we refuse or when we receive the light. Judgment has 2 sides to it. So now, judgment I've talked about for John as a consequence, a karmic cycle I've talked about with the Buddha. I'm not saying that judgment, as John describes it, and karma, in the Buddhist sense, are the same. They're not the same. These 2 have very different views of what we might call the afterlife, even. These 2 friends of mine and those 2 ideas about consequences are rooted in a very different view of what we might call the afterlife. But for both, there are consequences if we refuse to face ourselves, refuse to come to the light, as John would say, refuse to engage the eightfold process of learning to see things as they are, including and especially ourselves, as Buddha would put it. And their respective fixes, as I've said several times, are already embedded in the diagnosis of what's wrong. John, come to the light. Give up the denial and resistance. Face ourselves. Be willing to be seen as we are. This assumes an exacting self-discovery and self-awareness. The Buddha, face reality, the reality of suffering, craving, attachment, which causes it. Begin the process of knowing things as they are, including ourselves. And the Buddha doesn't just assume a process, he then describes it in much greater detail than what we find, frankly, anywhere in the New Testament. He describes in great detail what it's going to take for us to see things as they are, see ourselves as we are, right down to the roots of some of the most minute and subtle workings of consciousness itself. And this brings me back to the question of what is real. How do we summarize and compare their answers to that question, which took up a good bit of the prior episode? In some ways, this is the most difficult to summarize. I have to draw on things I've said not only in that last episode, but actually in nearly 20 episodes, almost 10 devoted to each of these friends. So just keep all that in mind, that behind this summary, there is all of that prior material. Okay, here we are. The Buddha went forth and saw 4 sights and embarked on a quest that eventually resulted in an awakening, an experience of freedom and release. And at the very core of that awakening was an insight into the nature of what I'm calling reality, including what we call the self, as on the one hand impermanent and in a very real sense unreal. And on the other hand, this awakening included the experience of what can be called bare awareness and awareness itself. And here's where I'm going with this. Especially in the Mahayana Buddhist tradition, the end result or aim of all of this is the experience of an all-encompassing compassion, which can't happen without that prior process, including that prior process of realizing we don't know what a self is. It's only that and letting go of our false idea of the self that can lead us to an experience of all-encompassing compassion. Compassion in us, from us, for all things, something we share in and extend. It's sometimes, as I've said before, called the Buddha mind. And while ultimate reality is not a word I think the Buddha would want me to use, it comes as close as I can get to what I mean when I use the term. The Buddha's answer to what is real is, in my own words, all-encompassing compassion for all things and all beings. John also went forth, we can say, because he went forth and hung out with a man named Jesus whose experiences of the divine shaped and formed how John is thinking here. So he says that what he knows and what he tells came about as a result of direct knowing and experience. In John's case, what he observed and touched and heard was a man, Jesus. And what he experienced was not only the words and actions of that man, but Jesus' experience of God, the divine. What he experienced, he describes as life itself, a life that results in light and in knowing. As John put it, the divine being was life, and the life was the light for all people, to repeat a phrase we've looked at numerous times. He's speaking of something other than the impermanent, and also something other than what we know or understand. Life leads to knowing. Life gives us light, or knowledge and wisdom. Life existed prior to the light of knowing and wisdom coming to us. Life originates in and is found in the divine nature itself. And of course, it's the divine nature, which for John is ultimate reality, though, again, like the Buddha, he doesn't use that term. As a reminder, that divine nature, which is the source of life, is, according to John chapter 1, towardsness, intoness, embrace, openness, and in the shorthand phrase that John came up with, God is love. Love is reality. Love is the source of all life. My two friends use very different vocabulary, but it seems clear to me they're describing the same truck. Different parts, perhaps, with different descriptions. They're putting their respective experiences together. And when I do that, I can say, at least from these two friends' perspectives, the truck reality is all-encompassing compassion for all things and beings and love itself. I'm sure they would add immediately that if this is what the truck is like, then the ultimate aim to pursue for us is to cultivate those qualities as well. And this is where we're different than the aliens. They're inviting us actually not just to touch the truck and understand it, but to experience it and, in a very real way, become the truck. To become those qualities that we just saw. To cultivate the deepest possible interconnection with and union with all-encompassing compassion and love. All right, I'm going to start drawing things to a conclusion in this episode. There are more differences to explore, even within the areas where I find these two friends in greatest harmony. For example, in John, reality is a being, a more than personal person, I sometimes say, but a being that is love, and so loves. There's a noun for which there's a verb, or which does the verb. The Buddha doesn't speak that way. And indeed, all his statements about there being no permanent self need really to be applied to however we understand a divine self as well. That conversation needs to be part of the conversation, so to speak. For the Buddha, the all-encompassing compassion is not, it would seem, felt by a supernatural, ultimate divine being. There's not a divine being noun that then does the all-encompassing compassion verb, so to speak. All-encompassing compassion for the Buddha is what is real in and of itself, not as a quality of a being that is other than that all-encompassing compassion. And yet I'm not sure that they're really quite as different as they might appear. Both are speaking of things we just actually can't know, things beyond human comprehension. And both come to describe that something, quote unquote, in ways that seem quite congruent to me. Compassion, love. Even references to bare awareness in the Buddha's case, and towardsness and into-ness and so on seem to be adjacent to one another. Into-ness and towardsness, self-awareness and self-knowledge, all of those things seem to have some adjacent congruence. Sometimes I describe myself as a Jesus follower and a Buddha meditator. It's an odd phrase for many who hear it, I know. How that applies here is that I'm convinced that reality, with a big R, is suprapersonal. And from the Buddha, I'm happy to speak of the divine as more than a person or a self or a being, as not a self in the Buddhist sense. I'm happy to do that. But with John, I do speak of the divine as more than a generalized impersonal quality, compassion, some sort of principle or attitude to cultivate. I do believe there is a noun that loves and has compassion. I get that primarily from John, but I don't think it dismisses the Buddha's insights. So I put all that together, these insights from my friends, and the conviction I have that what is real is a suprapersonal divine nature that does not just love, but is love. Does not just have compassion, but is all-encompassing compassion. That's my blending, as it were, of Jesus and Buddha. But the personal or more than personal being aspect comes from the Jesus follower part of my self-description. Now, I've discovered by experience the way that the Buddha's Eightfold Path provides me with very detailed, specific ways of coming to the light, or coming out of illusion, or addressing craving, and all of that kinds of things, cultivating self-awareness. And along the way, the Buddha's Dhamma provides me with practices, actually, that enable me to know directly this compassion and love that I understand to be ultimate reality. And not only to know it as if it, quote unquote, is an object or idea to know about, but to experience that love and compassion and be transformed by it and into it through what I would call union or interconnection, or absorbing it into myself and vice versa. And all of that describes the Buddha meditator part of my self-description. So Jesus follower, Buddha meditator. But I also describe myself as having been shaped by a number of other sacred heritages. I have more than just 2 friends. They've also touched the truck, these other friends, and they've also got things to add to this conversation. My other friends include the Bhagavad Gita and Moses, the Tao Te Ching of Lao Tzu, and the Quran. And I need to get them involved. I need to introduce them. I need to invite them to the house. And I'm going to do that in keeping with the timeline of when I became friends with each of them. You know, my oldest friend among them up to the most recent, which means I'll take them in this sequence: Moses, the Quran, the Bhagavad Gita, and then the Tao Te Ching of Lao Tzu. So, on to Moses next time.